Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm Tom Quigley, bringing the latest tips, tricks and techniques for all your contemporary painting and drawing needs, and welcome back to another video. Today's video is all about textures. So if you've wanted to try and recreate textures or you love adding texture into your work, then today's video is going to be the one for you. Now, the material of choice for creating a variety of textures is going to be using paint and inks, and more specifically the subject matter is going to be looking at found objects. And the found objects I'm going to be using today are actually from the beach. The reason why I've chosen those is there's a wide variety of different objects, which some of them look quite worn and weathered, and there's amazing what you can find at the beach. But that doesn't say that you can't use other materials, maybe just in your backyard, or maybe just on a walk, or maybe just in your own house. So variety is there. I'm just using this as my own subject. Anyway, I've talked way too much. Let's get on with the video.
Okay, so we're ready to start, and the first thing that I want you to do is just put the 3 lines down like I normally do and add a title. This one is abstract forms, in particular looking at found objects. I've also put a 1 centimetre border around the double page. Now the first activity, I'm just using the width of the ruler and then putting it horizontally, and also using the width of the ruler to create some squares. These are going to be for my texture squares. So in each square I'm going to create a different texture. Now the first one I'm going to be looking at is some rope. Again, found off the beach, and I found it was quite really interesting looking at all the strands, and you just got to look really closely to try and get a realistic look to it. Now what you'll notice, I'm doing a small section. I'm not drawing the full thing. That's not the objective today, so please only draw a small section and fill out that square, and take your time to make sure you've got all the tone and the line and the texture. And there's the next one, just looking at some driftwood, paying closely attention to all the grain in the wood, and you'll notice that all the lines are almost following each other. And so what you'll need to do in here, if you are going to be doing some wood, is alter the weight of lines. So you'll see I'm pressing quite hard and then lighten it up, and then I'll repeat the process so the lines follow each other. After that, I'll start putting some darker tones in there just to add some contrast and fill it out a little bit more. Now this will develop your drawing style. Okay, you will be, the more the look, the more that you will see, and later on in the task, you'll be an expert at trying to mimic that texture. Now this is quite a cool one, looking at really porous stone. It almost looks like it's got craters on it. So first thing, I'll put my circles on there, and then I've had to really add some dark tones to create some contrast, and also those craters. So that's really quite nice. One of my favourites on there. Again, filling out the square so it looks nice and finished. Here's the next one. What we're looking at is a shell. So again, another object that is full of different quality of lines. So I'll put the main ones in there. And then again, similar to the wood, what I'll do is create lines that follow each other. You just got to remember to do those ripples on there to create the look that it's got some texture on it. So really another one quite nice. Again, not drawing the full thing, I'm only drawing a small section of it, but it's looking to look really quite nice in my piece of work in the end. Again, just a little bit of tone just to add some realistic element to it. Now here's just some pottery, and you can see that the glaze has started to crack, which I thought was really quite nice. And you can use anything around the house that you might be quite nice to create these textures. In fact, to be honest, this texture is a really smooth texture, but I've made it look like it's quite rough. After you've done that, just make sure you put some labels on there so everyone knows what they are. Now, the artist of choice that I'm going to be looking at today is Peter Lanyon. He's a landscape artist, an abstract landscape artist, but we're going to be using the composition of his work to recreate ours. Now I've done a colour one and a black and white one, and I've just got 4 images here. I'm going to choose the top bright one. Now I've got an A3 piece of paper here, and I'm going to outline his work just in simplified form. So I'm looking at the shapes that I can see in his work and then recreating them on the A3 piece of paper. Now the reason why I've done this is I'm going to collect some objects and I'm going to put them in those spaces. So just making sure that I've done a half decent job. This isn't going to go anywhere, it's just literally for the composition that we're going to take a photograph of. So as I start putting some of these objects on here, I'm trying to look as best I possibly can, using a variety of different tones. As you can see there, I'm trying to pick the rope as those yellow lines, maybe using an old Coke can, or maybe some of the pottery and the stones to mimic some of those circles. Now you'll notice that sometimes I get it wrong and I have to relay it over the top and change the composition. That's just something that you're going to have to get used to. You're not going to get it right first of all, and you will have to change some things along the way. Now I'm trying to lay this up. It's not going to be a perfect representation. It's just not going to be possible. But that's not the point of doing this, really, to be honest. The whole point of doing this is trying to use a variety of textures and get better at doing them, okay? I'm just looking at his work as some inspiration. You can use some artistic elements, if you will, and decide what you want to, if you want to make some decisions and changing it. Now, I'm just showing you here, I'm just using my mobile phone. I took a picture and then I've edited the size down just to make sure I've got no overlapping sections on there. Once I've got that, I then print it, and then I've got a hard copy, almost, what you will. Now, I just want to show in my sketchbook that I've used this piece of work by Peter Lanyon. So I've trimmed it down nice and neatly, leaving a white border, and then I'm going to stick it in nice and neatly. Next to it, I'm also going to stick in the composition that I've just created. It's the same size, again, just leave a white border, and so it looks quite nice and neat and tidy. Now, as I just put that on there, again, underneath it, just write down what they are. I only put what the artist was, Peter Lanyon, but it would be beneficial if you put the name of the artwork and maybe the year it was created. Now here, I'm just going to do a viewfinder. Now, if you've never heard of a viewfinder shot, it's basically just looking at the piece of work or collage what I'm using, and then I'm just going to zone in on it and start to draw. Now I've speeded through the drawing, which I do apologise. What you've noticed that you can see there, I put a ground of tone on, and then I used a rubber just to get the highlights in there first of all, and now I'm going to put my darker tones in. Now, as I go through the piece of work, this doesn't have to be too neat. It's just getting you familiar with what you're drawing and more confident at the composition and the objects that you're drawing. So this is just a quick study. It's not too big at all whatsoever. So as I work into there, I'm just adding some of the sections, adding some of the lights and the darks, which will come helpful. And as you can see there, I've just boxed off a little area on my collage, and that's the area that I am drawing. Now, after I've done this, I take the masking tape off, and I'm ready for the next stage. Now, this is where it's going to get a little bit messy. We're going to be using some inks, and we're going to be using some paint. Now, you'll need an A4 piece of paper for this one. I tend to do it all the time, just using the width of the ruler on here, and you're going to be doing it in long strips, and there's a reason for I've done that. Now here, I'm just using some primer. You can use emulsion, you can use acrylic paint if you wish. You can use any household paint, to be honest. Now, the first one that I'm doing is a texture using mount board. You can use some card, so I'm just using the edge of it to create that kind of crisscross pattern. And I'm also here just doing some dragging and scraping just to see what the effect is going to be like. Now, obviously, doing white paint on white paper is not the easiest to see, but you will see it'll come to life once I add some ink afterwards. Here, I've just folded the card to create some extra patterns on there. Now, moving on to the second one. Here I'm going to be using a blotting technique. So I'm just using a piece of paper, lifting it up. Now it's a little bit dry there. You should do it a little bit thicker. I've redone it. I don't know if you can see that above, and put some thicker paint. Now straight away onto this one here, I'll put another layer of paint on, and I'm using a skewer. So I'm trying to recreate some of those lines that you maybe see on the piece of wood or the rope or even the shell. And you can use the skewer in different ways. So you can do the edges of it, so you can almost do some stippling with it, so going into the texture of the paint, which is quite nice, scratching into it. But please experiment. You might find some other ways that I haven't done on there. Again, you'll see I'm using the full strip there, not leaving any to waste, just to make sure I'm experimenting as much as I can. Now here I'm just using the humble paintbrush, again putting quite a lot of paint on there, to be honest, because I really want to see those bristles coming through, because it's really important. If you don't use a lot of paint, you'll find that you're going to have a very flat surface, and that's obviously not what we're after here. We're after a lot of texture. So I'm just working back on the surface, going back and forth to see, well, that's quite nice. Now here I've got some gum strip. You'll see that I'm gluing it on the back of it, so the shiny side is facing upwards. Now I've done this in a previous video before where we get a crackle effect. Now this is going to be quite nice for the wood, and I'm just using a slight bit of paint there. You don't need a lot on here, and after a while you'll see that the paint starts to separate and it looks really quite nice, especially if we're going to put some ink over the top. Now I'm sure you might have ordered something over lockdown and you might have some bubble wrap. So using that, just painting the bubble wrap on there and then just putting lightly on there. So just be careful you don't put too much on, you won't get the pattern coming through. Now also, just to add on that one, because I haven't got enough squares, I've just used some sponge. So if you want to have a go at doing that, you can also have a go. Now here I've just got some old pens that run out, and I've decided to just dab the end of it into some paint and use a variety of different sizes just to see. You also remember we did that porous stone. It'd be quite nice to have a go at doing that one. So I've just dried it. And now we're going to be using drawing inks. I didn't have any blue Brusho, so I've had to just use the diluted version. I've got some yellow, dilute that into a ramekin dish, and I've also got a green colour as well. So I've got 3 tones on there. You can just have blue and yellow if you want to, but from past experience, the yellow ends up turning green. So I've just got 3 colours on there. Now you don't have to be too careful on here. The reason why I'm using the blue and the yellow is that the piece of work that I've decided to work on is those colours. You can choose your own if you want to. Now here I'm just adding a bit of colour on there, a bit of water. You can add some salt if you want some extra tone and texture, but you don't have to. So I'm just going to continue doing that until they've all done, and then again just make sure it's fully dry. Now once it is dry, what we're going to be doing is reapplying the white paint. And the reason for that is that you can put the white paint over the top of it and then also go back over with the ink. And whatever happened to the white emulsion that you put on top, maybe say for example you put the white emulsion on the blue there and then go ahead and put the yellow ink over the top, you'll get a contrast within colours. Now moving on quite quickly here, I'm just cutting up into sections, and the reason why I'm doing that in a sketchbook, it's always nice to have these little experiments just to show where your ideas have come from. So I've finished on the left hand page, I've started on the right one now, and I'm just putting them in a block of 6, and then the bottom one finishes it off there. Again, please label them what you used. You could even discuss what was the most successful and what textures they could be used for. Now I've just used some masking tape really quickly, and what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be drawing out the simple shapes just like I did before of my composition. Now you can put some lines in there to suggest some of those textures if you want to, just like the rope or maybe the wood, but please do not spend too much time on here because you're going to be going over the top with the emulsion or the primer that I'm using. Now here I'm just doing that shoe, which is the bottom of the shoe, just using that crisscrossed method, which I think is quite effective. And then I'm going to continue going throughout the pieces of work. And now the only thing that I just want you to notice is that if you use emulsion, you will find that the ink goes lighter. So if you want to add some darker areas into your piece of work, do not put too much paint in there because the ink will be absorbed into it. Now as I keep on going on with this, I will try and mimic as many possible textures that I possibly can. Sometimes you end up using one material or tool more than others, and some that you just feel like it just wouldn't work. Now I'm obviously working on still a relatively small scale. If you were working on something larger than maybe, I don't know, A2 for example, the opportunity of using a lot more bolder textures that are a little bit more obvious, it's going to be a little bit better. This one's still really a sketchbook investigation, but I've just tried to get as much detail in there as I possibly can. Now what I'm doing, I'm looking at the artwork as I've used those colours, and I'm using the lighter tones and then obviously using some of the darker tones in the blue. But what I am noticing, the tone isn't dark enough. So what I've decided to do is use some Quink, put it into the blue ultramarine ink and then mix it together, and then that helps me with some darker tones. So you can either use black ink if you want to, or you could use the Quink. After I decided to use the Quink, I decided to use some black oil pastel, which is also quite a nice choice if you want to have a go at doing that. So as I keep on working around here, just looking at some of the areas that I feel like I've got some really dark areas in them, trying to get a closest look to them. And here, as I did before in my testers, putting some white highlights in there using the skewer. You can use the paintbrush as well if you wanted to. It just adds a little bit more contrast between them. And there you go, that's what I said before, using the oil pastel just to get some really, really dark areas on there. And that's it really, to be honest. If you just keep on refining it, you will end up with a really, really quite a nice piece.
Well, that's it guys for another tutorial. Hopefully it was enjoyable, hopefully it was informative, and it's expanded your knowledge of techniques and processes, in particular looking at textures and using found objects in this one. I know I've really enjoyed doing this activity, and hopefully you have too. If you haven't seen any other tutorials, please click up on the pop-up banner at the top there, and that will take you to a playlist of all the tutorials that I have done. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I will see you on the next video. See you later. Bye.